So there are kind of two groups of people that Paul is speaking against in this letter. There are those that we've talked about earlier that were preaching the gospel to bring him pain. And then there are others who apparently are preaching another gospel. He doesn't really rail too hard against the first group, but he really goes hard against the second group. What are the, if you could say, the fundamentals or the central concepts of the gospel that perhaps this group was getting that these weren't, and why would he go so hard against that second group?
That's a well put question, Graham. It's important to recognize that Paul will accept people who are preaching what he considers to be the true gospel, even if they're doing it in such a way that it causes him personal pain. But he has no patience with people who are preaching what he considers to be a false gospel. He calls them the mutilation in here. And the place where he gives us a hint of what he has in mind is at the end of chapter 3, verse 18, where he says that they're enemies of the cross of Christ. And that has to mean something like they are teaching in such a way that what Christ did on the cross is not necessary. And probably the best way to think about that is what he says in chapter 3, that I want to be found in the righteousness of Christ. And that is a righteousness that is only established by God for us at the cross, as God punishes Christ in our place, as Christ becomes our stand-in, our righteousness. So the merit of Christ has to be applied to us, his righteousness on our behalf, because our sin is taken away at the cross. For Paul, you don't hold to the righteousness of Christ being ours because of the cross, and as far as he's concerned, you've become an enemy of the cross and spiritually his enemy as well. You're teaching a false gospel. He says that their belly is their God. And if there is, when there is teaching that really is about affirming when teaching is about really not our coming into obedience to the Lord and being brought into line with him and with his purposes. But when he just becomes the chaplain for our desires, and he is just called to come in and bless our way of life, an addendum to our personal agenda that's really driven by our own appetites or our desires, whether it's literal hunger, or whether it's sexual appetite, or whether it's materialism, whether it's ambition. Whenever God becomes a servant to our bellies, for Paul, that's a false gospel. And then the other thing that he says in here is that their God is their belly, and they glory in their shame. And that's all a part of that second denial of the gospel, that you revel in this celebration of this way of life that God is supposed to somehow bless. And then the third thing he says here is that they think about worldly things, and then he contrasts that with our citizenship being in heaven with Christ Jesus. Whenever the church, whenever the gospel becomes used to just promote some sort of other agenda besides the things of the world, besides the agenda of God reclaiming and redeeming his creation, then Paul is going to have a big problem with that. Now, there are some people who can do this kind of in a really supernatural way. Then he was doing that with the Colossians. That's what was happening in Colossae, where there was all this angelic speculation, veneration of angels. But what it was doing was it was cultivating pride, and it was cultivating a life that Paul called worldly, even though it was supposedly heavenly. But so you can do this in a supernaturalistic way and be on the wrong side of Paul, or you could do it in a naturalistic way and be on the wrong side of Paul, where you reduce the whole Christian story, the whole biblical view, the whole theological project to just serving this world's ends. And honestly, in the last couple of hundred years, that has been the greatest tendency in the church in the West, where with a very strong anti-supernaturalistic bias, God doesn't do miracles, God couldn't bring a virgin child into the world, and dead people don't rise from the dead. There's been this project to reconcile Christianity with that worldview, a worldly worldview that comes and takes charge of the biblical worldview and won't let it speak its piece, so that all the church is left with is, bare-knuckled politics or just sort of a vague do-goodism that has really lost the sense of the power of God to make people over and to make deep and lasting change in society. So I'd say for Paul, in terms of this letter, the tenets of the gospel that he would want to promote is it's the power of the cross to bring healing and forgiveness and relationship with God. The call to obey something beyond our bellies, to submit ourselves to the Lord of the universe, who has a greater good in view for us in service to him, and to, if I can go over to Colossians, to seek the things above, and to pay attention to the commonwealth of heaven, to the city of God, to this ultimate citizenship that calls us beyond earthly loyalties and earthly agendas into service of his kingdom.